The world into which Gandalf stepped was one already fraying at the edges, a land where the scars of ancient wars had never fully healed, and where shadows gathered slowly but surely in the corners of forgotten kingdoms. The Third Age carried with it the illusion of peace, yet beneath that illusion lay the tremors of unrest, the murmurings of powers thought long defeated. Men clung to their crumbling strongholds, elves faded into dwindling sanctuaries, and the dwarves, withdrawn to their stone halls, looked inward rather than outward. It was a world balanced on a knife's edge, though most who lived within it could not yet perceive how close they stood to the abyss. The Valar had sent emissaries because they saw what the children of Ilúvatar could not. The great enemy, though weakened, had not been destroyed. Sauron endured, his spirit never relinquishing its hunger for dominion. His servants still roamed, and his malice lay coiled like a serpent, waiting. Into this subtle battlefield the Astari were sent, not to dominate by displays of power, but to guide, to counsel, to strengthen the free peoples against the inevitable resurgence of darkness. It was a mandate carefully framed, for raw might would have provoked resistance or corrupted the very ones it sought to save. Gandalf's arrival, cloaked in the form of an old wanderer, was a deliberate paradox. He bore wisdom older than mountains, yet he walked among the weary and the humble, listening more than commanding, watching more than declaring. Few could grasp that behind the grey cloak and staff lived a spirit of fire, one who had dwelt in the light of the blessed realm. Fewer still could imagine that such a figure, outwardly frail and subject to hunger, fatigue, and doubt, was chosen precisely because he would not seize dominion for himself. His mission was more subtle than that, to nurture the flame of resistance without ever overshadowing it. It is important to see how fragile Middle-earth was at this moment. The kingdoms of men no longer stood united. Gondor, though proud, had been hollowed by attrition, its stewards carrying the burden of a throne left vacant too long. Rohan was strong in horses and valor, yet vulnerable to treachery. The elves, who once stood as a bulwark, were turning away, their hearts bound to the fading west. The dwarves, ever proud of their lineage, had lost Moria, and carried bitter grudges that isolated them. Only in the Shire, a small land of quiet fields, did a semblance of peace persist, though it was born not of strength, but of obscurity. This was the world Gandalf entered, and it was into such fractured soil that he sought to sow seeds of endurance. The danger was not only military, but spiritual. If despair took root, no sword or wall would suffice to resist Sauron's designs. The peoples of Middle-earth, scattered and mistrustful of one another, might collapse without ever seeing his armies march. Gandalf's role was to perceive the hidden fault lines and to strengthen hearts before stone. His wisdom lay not in marshalling troops, but in discerning where the smallest kindling of hope might grow into a fire that could withstand the storm. Yet, at this early stage, he remained a figure on the margins, a pilgrim moving through towns, speaking with rulers, learning the paths of the land. He watched and listened, not revealing all he knew, for to declare the full weight of his mission would have drawn suspicion. Instead, he built trust slowly, sometimes through counsel, sometimes through silence, shaping the beginnings of bonds that one day might hold. Even then, the shadow lengthened, though it was not yet named aloud. Whispers of ancient evil stirred in distant lands, and strange movements in the east and south hinted that Sauron's servants had not been idle. To understand Gandalf's secret, we must see that concealment began not as a strategy of war, but as a condition of his very being. The Valar required the Astari to veil their nature, to limit themselves, to bear mortality's likeness, so that they might not dominate the wills of those they came to aid. Thus, Gandalf's presence in this fractured age was itself a secret, a truth hidden in plain sight, a Maya disguised as a grey wanderer. He had to guard that truth carefully, for should Sauron discern it fully, the balance of the coming struggle might shift before the peoples of Middle-earth were ready. Already the stage was set for conflict, though few recognized it. Old prophecies stirred, relics whispered their names through forgotten halls, and the ruins of Númenor lingered like an unhealed wound upon the hearts of men. It was in such an atmosphere that Gandalf began his long labor of patience. He bore within him a power that could kindle courage where despair threatened, yet he kept it veiled, waiting for the right moment when revelation would not destroy more than it saved. And so, the question quietly forms. If Gandalf was truly one of the immortal Maiar, cloaked in humility, why did he not reveal his power openly and drive Sauron back before his strength returned? To answer this, we must look more closely at the being Gandalf truly was before he came to Middle-earth, and the oath of restraint that bound him from the first step he took upon its shores. Before we can understand why Gandalf walked among mortals in the guise of frailty, we must look to the spirit that he truly was, long before the Third Age ever dawned. He was Olorin in the west, one of the Maiar, who dwelt in the timeless lands beyond the sea. Unlike others of his kin who delighted in craft, battle, or dominion, Olorin's wisdom was bound to quietness, reflection, and compassion. In the gardens of Lorien he walked often, learning patience from Ermo, and in the halls of Nienna he learned pity for all who suffer. These lessons etched themselves deeply into his being, for he was never the most powerful of the Maiar, nor the most renowned, but he was perhaps the most attentive to the sorrows of others. It was this quality that set him apart, and that would shape the burden he would later bear. When the Valar gathered in council to decide how to answer the lingering threat of Sauron, they resolved not to send armies, nor to wield their own power directly. That path had led to ruin before, in the wars against Morgoth, where great displays of might had shattered lands and nearly destroyed the world. This time, they chose a gentler, more hidden road. They would send emissaries, cloaked in the likeness of men, stripped of the full majesty of their being, forbidden to reveal their nature outright, or to dominate the wills of others. This was a covenant of limitation, one born of hard lessons and deep caution. Olorin, though hesitant, was chosen. He even confessed fear at the thought of facing the dark once again, for he knew the weight of such a trial. Yet Manwë insisted, and Vada herself strengthened him, saying his humility and pity were his true armor. Thus he came eastward, clothed in the form of an aged man. What was once effortless became labor. His body wearied, his spirit felt the pull of time, and though his essence remained immortal, he knew pain and hunger, sorrow and fatigue. This was not punishment, but safeguard. The Astari were bound so that they might guide without commanding, teach without bending the wills of men and elves to their own design. Their task was persuasion, patience, and example, not domination. It was a role that demanded restraint, for though the fire of divine strength still burned within them, to use it in full would risk turning them into tyrants, little different from the one they opposed. In this form, Olorin became Gandalf the Grey, a pilgrim and counsellor, his staff more a symbol of guidance than of raw power. Yet even veiled, he carried within him a light too great to be hidden entirely. Círdan, the ancient shipwright who greeted him upon his arrival, saw it immediately. Perceiving the quiet fire within Gandalf's spirit, Círdan entrusted him with Narya, the Ring of Fire, one of the 3 rings of the elves. With this hidden gift, Gandalf bore a secret that Sauron never uncovered, the power to kindle courage and resist despair, to keep alive the flame of hope even when all else faltered. But the ring's fire was veiled, just as his true nature was veiled, and so he carried it not as a weapon, but as a silent charge. To those who met him in Middle-earth, he was a mysterious wanderer, sometimes stern, often kind, always watchful. Few knew that his eyes had seen the light of the trees long before the sun and moon were kindled, or that his voice carried the memory of music sung before the world was made. Yet he rarely spoke of such things, for secrecy was not merely a choice, but a necessity. If Sauron had discerned who Gandalf truly was, he would have bent all his malice to destroy him early, perceiving him as a rival Maiar rather than a meddling old wanderer. By concealing his essence, Gandalf walked freely, underestimated, allowed to plant seeds that Sauron did not think worth uprooting until it was too late. And yet, secrecy carried its own cost. Those who dealt with Gandalf often suspected him of withholding too much. His riddles, his silences, his refusal to explain all that he knew led some to mistrust him. Denethor in Gondor, Saruman among the Astari, even certain elves of Rivendell, each wondered what designs lay behind his guarded speech. But Gandalf bore that burden knowingly, for to speak all would have endangered more than silence ever could. He chose to carry suspicion rather than risk awakening Sauron's gaze. So we see the paradox at the heart of his being, a spirit of immense light bound in grey robes, a bearer of fire disguised as a weary pilgrim. He could not reveal himself, nor could he wield his strength freely, for to do so would have undone the very purpose of his mission. And thus we come closer to the heart of his secret, the truth that Sauron could never grasp, that power concealed in humility was greater than power brandished in pride. But this raises another question, one that the Dark Lord himself never thought to ask. If Gandalf's fire was hidden, and his strength veiled, how could Sauron, master of cunning and dominion, fail to perceive the threat? To answer that, we must turn our gaze from the grey pilgrim to the eye that sought to pierce every shadow, and yet remained blind to the one flame that could undo him. If Gandalf's secret was that he bore a hidden fire, veiled beneath humility, then Sauron's secret weakness was his inability to recognize it. The Dark Lord, ever watchful, believed himself to be the great master of perception, the one eye that missed nothing beneath the heavens. Yet his vision was distorted, shaped not by wisdom, but by arrogance. He sought only reflections of himself, figures of dominion, wielders of armies, those who would stretch forth their hands to claim mastery over others. To him, power meant control, and control meant fear. In this blindness, he overlooked the subtler forces that worked quietly against him. This flaw was no accident. Long ago, when he served Morgoth, Sauron had learned the art of domination, bending wills with promises and threats alike. When he forged the rings of power, his intent was not to strengthen others, but to bind them, to draw their hearts into his own flame. Dominion had become his language, and he believed all others would speak it as well. If Gandalf or any of the Astari bore strength, Sauron assumed they would reveal it through conquest, that they might walk disguised, choosing persuasion over coercion, was beyond his imagining. Thus, when the grey pilgrim wandered across Middle-earth, cloaked in weariness and leaning on his staff, Sauron did not regard him as a true adversary. He considered him an irritant, a meddler perhaps, but not a rival worthy of his full malice. His gaze turned instead to kings and lords, to realms he might corrupt, to armies he might sway. He watched the palaces of Gondor, the fading strongholds of the elves, and the restless movements of men in the east and south. To the Shire he gave no thought, to hobbits he gave no name, and to Gandalf's concealed flame he gave no notice. Yet this blindness was perilous, for it allowed Gandalf to move where others could not. Sauron's eye was sharp, but narrow. It sought grandeur, not humility. When he scoured Middle-earth for threats, he looked for crowns and banners, not cloaks and riddles. He counted armies, not friendships. He measured fortresses, not hearthsides. This selective vision left him unprepared for the truth that the greatest danger to his dominion would not come from a rival king, but from the courage of the small, guided by the counsel of one he thought harmless. Still, Sauron's vigilance was not entirely without reach. Through his servants, through spies, and most of all through the Palantiri, he searched endlessly for knowledge of his foes. He saw Saruman's hunger for power and encouraged it, believing the White Wizard could be bent into his service. He saw Denethor's pride and despair and fed it with dark whispers. He even sought to ensnare the elves by tempting them with fading power. Yet when his gaze fell toward Gandalf, he misjudged the grey pilgrim, for he mistook restraint as weakness. He never conceived that concealment might itself be a weapon sharper than any blade. This blindness is not without irony, for Sauron himself was once a Maiar, kin in essence to Gandalf, though corrupted beyond recall. He should have understood the veiling of power, for he had once used it cunningly in the Second Age, appearing fair to the elves of Eregion as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. But arrogance had long since stripped him of subtlety. In his obsession with domination, he forgot that guile could be greater than force, that humility could mask might. The very stratagem he had once wielded became the one he could no longer see. And so Gandalf's greatest advantage endured, to remain underestimated. Each time he appeared at councils, each time he wandered through distant lands, Sauron accounted him as nothing more than an interfering emissary. Even when Gandalf stood at the head of resistance in Rohan, or rallied hearts in Gondor, the Dark Lord assumed some greater power was at work behind him. For surely, in his eyes, no solitary wanderer could wield such influence. Thus, his suspicion turned toward Aragorn, toward kingship reborn, toward weapons and banners, while the grey pilgrim continued his quiet labor unnoticed. But this raises a deeper paradox, one worth pausing to consider. If Gandalf bore Narya, the Ring of Fire, and if his spirit was indeed a Maiar's, how was it possible that Sauron did not sense it? The answer lies partly in his blindness, but partly also in the art of concealment itself. For fire, when hidden, can warm without revealing its flame, and a ring, worn in silence, can inspire without betraying its bearer. This concealed gift was not simply a trinket or symbol. It was a mandate hidden even from the Dark Lord's eye. And so, as we follow Gandalf's path further, we must turn from Sauron's blindness to the gift that Círdan bestowed upon the Grey Pilgrim. The secret flame of Narya, hidden in plain sight, shaping the very currents of resistance while remaining veiled from the eye of Barad-dûr. If Sauron's blindness left him unable to perceive Gandalf's true danger, then the heart of that hidden peril lay in a gift quietly entrusted to him upon his very arrival. When the Grey Pilgrim first set foot in Middle-earth, weary from the long passage, and cloaked in the likeness of an aged wanderer, it was Círdan the shipwright who greeted him at the havens. Círdan was no ordinary elf. He was among the eldest of his kind, one who had seen the light of the two trees, and who carried the long patience of ages in his gaze. In Gandalf, he discerned more than frailty. He perceived the quiet flame within, the kindled spirit that had dwelt in the West before the shaping of the world. And so, without hesitation, Círdan placed into Gandalf's keeping a relic of immense weight, Narya, the Ring of Fire. This gift was not given lightly. The 3 rings of the elves had been crafted not for war, but for preservation, for the safeguarding of beauty and the resistance of decay. Each carried a fragment of power untouched by Sauron's hand, and each was hidden carefully to prevent discovery. To bear one was both honor and burden, for it bound the heart of the bearer to the fate of all free peoples. In Gandalf's hand, Narya shone unseen, its flame veiled from the searching eye of Barad-dûr. It could not shatter armies or level towers, but it carried a subtler strength, the power to inspire courage, to stir weary hearts, to kindle endurance against despair. Where Sauron sought to break wills through fear, Narya's fire nurtured resilience. Gandalf understood at once the weight of this charge. He was forbidden to dominate, yet through Narya he could awaken what lay dormant in others. The courage to resist, the faith to endure, the capacity to hope even when all seemed lost. This was no small gift, for despair is often a sharper weapon than sword or flame, and in the long struggle against Sauron, despair was his most faithful servant. Each whisper of hopelessness, each faltering of resolve, was a victory for the Dark Lord. Against this unseen assault, Gandalf carried a hidden counterstroke. His very presence became a quiet fire in the hearts of others, unrecognized perhaps even by those he stirred, but essential to their survival. Yet the secrecy of this gift was absolute, even among the wise. Few knew of Narya's resting place. Gandalf never flaunted it, never invoked it openly, never declared himself its bearer. To do so would have risked betrayal, for if Sauron had discovered the truth, his gaze would have turned with full fury upon the Grey Pilgrim long before the time was ripe. Instead, Gandalf bore the ring in silence, letting its influence work invisibly. A sudden renewal of strength among weary soldiers, a spark of courage when all seemed doomed, a resilience that carried beyond reason. These were the quiet workings of the hidden fire. It was never spectacle, always endurance. There is in this concealment a profound irony. Sauron, who forged the One Ring to enslave the wills of others, was blind to a ring whose purpose was to free those wills from despair. He could not fathom that such a tool might exist, for his own imagination was shackled by pride. Thus, the Grey Pilgrim's greatest weapon remained the one the Dark Lord never thought to look for. It is no exaggeration to say that without Naria's secret influence, the long resistance of Middle-earth might have withered in hopelessness long before the Ring-bearer's quest began. But Gandalf's burden was heavy, for to bear a ring of power was to bind oneself more deeply to the fate of the world, and to the cost of its salvation. Though unseen, its weight pressed on him, deepening his weariness even as it fueled his resolve. In his silences, in the long shadows of his wanderings, there was always the quiet knowledge that he bore a fire Sauron must never discover, and yet one he must use without ever being seen to wield it. Still, one question lingers quietly at the edge of this truth. How did Gandalf manage to walk so long in concealment, bearing such fire, without betraying its presence to his great enemy? To answer this, we must look beyond the gift itself to the art by which it was preserved, the deliberate craft of secrecy, the choice to wander without throne or title, the patient labor of hiding power within humility. To understand how Gandalf bore Narnia without ever betraying it, we must turn from the gift itself to the art by which it remained hidden. For concealment was not a single act, but a discipline sustained across centuries, a long weaving of silence, misdirection, and restraint. The Valar had sent him with strictures. He was forbidden to dominate, forbidden to reveal his full strength, forbidden to set himself as a ruler. These were not shackles placed upon him to diminish his worth, but protections against the corruption that had undone so many of the mighty before him. To carry Narnia openly, to wield it as one might a sword or a crown, would have broken the covenant. Yet to bury its influence entirely would have rendered the gift meaningless. Gandalf's task, then, was to balance fire and shadow, to let its warmth flow invisibly, while never drawing the eye of Sauron to its source. This labor took the shape of a life that appeared endlessly meandering. Gandalf wandered roads where no armies marched, tarried in villages that kings scarcely knew, and gave his counsel in riddles rather than proclamations. He cultivated the image of a meddler rather than a monarch, a figure half distrusted, half amused over. His arrival was often heralded not by fanfare, but by smoke drifting from his pipe, or laughter at a firework display in some forgotten field. Yet beneath these masks of whimsy, the secret fire worked quiet and steady, binding hearts, stirring courage, planting seeds of endurance where none had been. To some, it seemed he wasted his years in trifles, yet these trifles held the strength of strategy. This path was not without its burdens. To those who longed for certainty, Gandalf's concealments could appear manipulative. He gave enough truth to guide, but rarely the whole. To the steward of Gondor, his reticence was arrogance. To Saruman, it was weakness. Even among friends, there were moments of frustration. Why would he not speak plainly? Why would he not seize power if he had it? Why would he let mortals stumble in doubt when a clear command might have saved them from ruin? The answer, though hidden, was consistent. Should Gandalf have revealed all he knew, or imposed his will without question, the peoples of Middle-earth would have come to lean upon him as a crutch. Their own resolve would have withered, and their freedom would have been replaced by obedience. The victory won would not have been theirs but his, and that was not the victory he was sent to achieve. We may see this principle most clearly in his dealings with the Shire. For centuries, Gandalf watched over the hobbits, a people whom Sauron ignored, and even the wise scarcely considered significant. He could have ruled them, molded them into weapons, drawn them into the wider struggles of the world. Yet he did not. Instead, he nurtured their simplicity, preserving their isolation as a shield against corruption. He introduced them only to what they could bear, allowing them to grow in strength without ever knowing the full scope of the shadow that gathered beyond their borders. Here, the art of concealment was not mere silence, but active shaping, a patient tending of lives so that, when the time came, they would rise by their own will rather than by command. But concealment extended far beyond the hobbits. In councils with kings and stewards, Gandalf withheld the full depth of his foresight. When he suspected Sauron's hand behind certain movements, he spoke carefully, never declaring too soon, lest the revelation drive men into panic or folly. His words were riddles, not to obscure truth, but to protect it until the moment was ripe. In this, his restraint often invited mistrust. Denethor, the steward of Gondor, grew convinced that Gandalf sought the throne for himself, that his counsel was but a mask for ambition. Saruman, once head of the White Council, looked upon Gandalf's humility with disdain, never grasping that the very concealment he mocked was the shield that kept Sauron blind. This irony is telling. Where Saruman adorned himself with knowledge, titles, and authority, Gandalf clothed himself in plainness. Saruman craved recognition. Gandalf avoided it. Saruman trusted in devices and dominion. Gandalf in secrecy and endurance. It is no wonder that when the time came, Sauron mistook Saruman for his true rival, never realizing that the Grey Pilgrim, cloaked in patience, bore the greater threat. Still, secrecy was never without cost. Gandalf carried suspicion wherever he went, and the loneliness of such a burden cannot be ignored. To bear truth that cannot be spoken, to wield power that must remain unseen, is to walk always at a remove from those one serves. He was trusted by many, loved by some, yet fully known by almost none. The mask of concealment became both protection and prison, isolating him even as it preserved the hope of the world. In the end, this art of concealment was not passive, but active, a continual labor requiring vigilance. To veil fire is harder than to let it blaze. To restrain knowledge is harder than to declare it. Gandalf bore that strain for centuries, weaving secrecy into every step, every word, every silence. It was this mastery of restraint that allowed him to carry Narya without betraying it, to kindle hope without alerting the eye, to walk unseen beneath the very shadow he opposed. Yet concealment could not remain unchallenged forever. For as Gandalf wove his quiet work, another of the Astari watched him with growing envy, unable to accept the wisdom of such restraint. Saruman, the White, who once stood as leader of their order, began to twist his gaze toward dominion, interpreting secrecy as weakness, humility as folly. And in that growing jealousy lay the seed of betrayal, the moment when concealment would no longer serve only to shield against Sauron, but to guard against treachery from one once counted as a brother. If concealment was Gandalf's shield, then envy was the crack through which that shield was tested, for Saruman's growing jealousy soon became a force nearly as dangerous as Sauron himself. At the beginning, there was no rift between them. Saruman the White was the head of the Astari, appointed as chief by the Valar themselves, his knowledge vast, his voice commanding, his authority clear. He had studied the arts of craft and law with diligence, and he prided himself on being the wisest among them. When the White Council was formed to resist the growing shadow, it was Saruman who presided, Saruman whose voice carried weight in every decision. Gandalf, cloaked in his grey humility, was content to stand beside him, listening, advising, yet never seeking prominence. But in the silence of that humility, Saruman began to see a threat that did not exist. It is telling that Saruman's jealousy grew not from Gandalf's proclamations, but from his silences. Gandalf revealed little, yet whenever he spoke, his words carried a weight that even the proudest could not deny. Kings listened, stewards considered, elves respected, and even the simple hobbits grew in stature beneath his counsel. Saruman could not fail to notice how others trusted the Grey Pilgrim despite his lack of authority, and this trust, quiet and unforced, gnawed at him more deeply than any open contest might have. For Saruman had sought power in titles, in knowledge hoarded, in symbols of mastery. Gandalf, without crown or seat, gathered influence in ways Saruman could neither command nor understand. This divergence grew sharper as whispers of Sauron's return multiplied. Gandalf, guided by patience, urged vigilance and caution, seeking signs in shadows, studying relics, watching the movements of the enemy's servants. Saruman, by contrast, sought mastery over the enemy's tools. He peered into the Palantiri, seeking knowledge by means perilous. He studied the craft of rings, delving into lore long entwined with treachery. Where Gandalf saw danger in such pursuits, Saruman saw opportunity, and in this hunger, jealousy bloomed into disdain. He began to scorn Gandalf's concealments as weakness, his riddles as evasions, his refusals as cowardice. Yet Saruman's perception was itself a mirror of Sauron's blindness. He mistook Gandalf's humility for impotence, never understanding that it was deliberate restraint. He mistook the Grey Pilgrim's wandering for aimlessness, never grasping that every step was part of a greater design. And so, Saruman came to believe that he, not Gandalf, was the one chosen to master the crisis of the age. He clothed himself in pride, reinforcing his tower at Orthanc, gathering armies of his own, crafting engines of war, and secretly beginning to shape a kingdom that mirrored the dominion he claimed to oppose. But envy rarely hides itself for long. When the White Council gathered to debate how best to act against the shadow stirring in Dol Guldur, Saruman argued with certainty that no great threat lingered there. He urged delay, dismissal, the pretense that watchfulness was unnecessary. Gandalf, who had already perceived Sauron's hand at work, urged otherwise. It was he who counselled decisive action. To strike before the enemy grew too strong. The council hesitated, but Galadriel, whose foresight was keen, declared that if she must follow one alone, it would be Gandalf. Those words were a spark that kindled a fire of bitterness in Saruman's heart, for he had always believed himself first among the wise. From that moment forward, his jealousy hardened into resentment. This resentment revealed itself more plainly in his dealings with Gandalf. When Gandalf sought knowledge from Orthanc, Saruman treated him with a patronizing tone, feigning superiority, always pressing for more than Gandalf would reveal. He demanded to know what the Grey Pilgrim had uncovered in his wanderings, what secrets he concealed, what truth he withheld. Gandalf, bound by the art of concealment, gave little. This silence deepened Saruman's suspicion, convincing him that Gandalf carried some hidden power, some secret authority that he alone should have borne. The irony, of course, is that Saruman's suspicion was correct, but not in the way he imagined. Gandalf did carry a secret flame, but it was not a weapon to be claimed. It was a trust that could only be born in humility. It is no coincidence that Saruman's fall followed so closely his jealousy. For jealousy leads not merely to resentment, but to imitation of that which is envied. In seeking to outdo Gandalf, Saruman ceased to oppose Sauron, and began to resemble him. He desired mastery, and in that desire he turned to the enemy's tools. The Palantir, once a stone of sight, became his chain. The lore of ring-making, once a subject of study, became his obsession. His pride drove him to mirror the very dominion he claimed to resist. And so, the rivalry with Gandalf became more than a personal grievance. It became the path by which Saruman himself slipped into the shadow. This was the true danger Gandalf's secrecy invited. Not that it gave Sauron an opening, but that it drove those who could not understand it into betrayal. For Saruman, who should have been a brother in the same cause, came to see Gandalf as his rival, his obstacle, his enemy. And thus, when Sauron sought to ensnare the wise, it was Saruman who became his ally, willingly or not, bound by envy and pride. The consequence of this betrayal would be profound. Gandalf's concealment, which had shielded him from Sauron's gaze, now had to shield him from Saruman's as well. The art of secrecy became more perilous, for his rival was not blind to him, but obsessed with unmasking him. Every step Gandalf took, Saruman watched. Every silence, every riddle, every hidden flame, Saruman sought to uncover. Yet the Grey Pilgrim did not falter. He bore mistrust, he bore captivity, he bore the scorn of one who should have been his ally, all in order to preserve the greater secrecy that still protected Middle-earth from ruin. But Saruman was not the only one to question Gandalf's concealment. In Gondor, too, mistrust simmered. The steward Denethor, proud and burdened by the weight of his house, came to see in Gandalf not a counselor, but a rival, one who kept secrets too closely, one who might seek a throne, not his own. To follow Gandalf further, we must now turn from the jealousy of Saruman to the suspicion of Denethor, where concealment again became both shield and stumbling block in the great struggle against the shadow. The mistrust that had driven Saruman into envy found its echo in Gondor, where Denethor, the steward of the White City, bore his own suspicions toward the Grey Pilgrim. If Saruman's jealousy was born of rivalry, Denethor's suspicion was born of pride and the weight of stewardship that pressed down upon his house. For centuries, Gondor had stood as the bulwark against Mordor, its walls guarding the last hope of men, its blood spilled unceasingly in battles that few beyond its borders truly recognized. In such a crucible, Denethor grew hardened, proud, and wary of any influence that might weaken his hold. When Gandalf came often to Minas Tirith, bearing counsel wrapped in riddles, Denethor did not see wisdom, but manipulation. To him, Gandalf was not a guide, but a usurper in disguise, a wanderer whose secrecy masked ambition. This mistrust was sharpened by the long decay of Gondor itself. Once the heir of Númenor's greatness, its glory had waned, its line of kings broken, its throne left empty. The stewards ruled in the absence of kings, and in that absence, Denethor found both burden and justification for his pride. He had inherited not only a kingdom under siege, but also the bitter knowledge that the strength of men was fading. In that decline, Gandalf's presence was both a comfort and a threat. The grey pilgrim spoke often of hidden dangers, of shadows lengthening, of enemies stirring. Yet he rarely gave the full measure of what he knew. Denethor, who trusted only in plain truths and iron strength, grew restless with such half-revealed warnings. He saw in Gandalf's concealment the shadow of hidden designs, and in his humility the mask of ambition. The irony was cruel. Gandalf sought only to preserve Gondor, yet his very restraint made Denethor believe he sought to rule it. Each time Gandalf refused to grasp at authority, Denethor saw it as proof that he was biding his time for a greater seizure. Each silence deepened mistrust, each riddle widened the gap between them. And when Gandalf spoke of the return of Isildur's line, Denethor's suspicion became sharper still, for in Aragorn he saw not hope restored, but the end of his own stewardship. Gandalf, who supported the heir of kings, thus appeared to Denethor not as an ally, but as an architect of his undoing. Yet Denethor's suspicion did not spring only from pride. Like Saruman, he had peered into a palantir, and through it had sought to understand the true measure of the enemy's strength. What he saw was terrible. Armies without number, shadows that stretched across the land, towers ablaze with malice. In the face of such visions, despair had taken root in his heart. But the palantir was a treacherous guide, for Sauron, who bent its images to his will, revealed only what would deepen fear. Denethor believed himself to see truth, but what he saw was truth shaped by deception. In that despair, Gandalf's concealment was intolerable. Why should the grey pilgrim withhold knowledge, if indeed he sought to save Gondor? Why should he speak in riddles when ruin loomed so clearly? To Denethor, Gandalf's secrecy was no longer a safeguard, but a betrayal. Still, Gandalf endured the steward's mistrust, for he knew the burden Denethor bore. He saw in him a man hardened by endless struggle, embittered by thankless duty, proud of a line that would not endure. He did not answer pride with pride, nor suspicion with anger. Instead, he continued his work quietly, strengthening what walls he could, guiding what captains would listen, kindling what courage had not yet withered. He bore Denethor's scorn because the need of Gondor was too great to abandon. But the consequences of mistrust could not be so easily dismissed. Denethor's suspicion weakened Gondor at its moment of greatest peril, for it set him at odds with the very ally who might have steadied him. When the siege of Minas Tirith came, the steward's despair drove him to madness, and his refusal to trust Gandalf left the city leaderless at the hour of its trial. Yet even in that moment of ruin, Gandalf did not reveal the full depth of his power. He stood at the gates, a white flame against shadow, but he did not wield dominion. He fought as steward, not as king, holding the city until hope arrived in other hands. It is here that we glimpse again the burden of concealment. Gandalf might have revealed more, spoken more plainly, commanded more forcefully, but in doing so, he would have undone the very purpose of his mission. To resist Sauron through domination would have been to imitate him. To claim Gondor as his own would have corrupted the victory. So Gandalf bore suspicion, bore even open hostility, in order to preserve the greater hope. And yet, the cost was not small. His secrecy left him misunderstood, even among those he most sought to protect. The same fire that warmed the hearts of hobbits and stirred courage in the weak appeared to men like Denethor as a consuming blaze, a rival's flame that threatened their own rule. The paradox sharpened with each passing year, Concealment preserved Middle-earth from Sauron's gaze, but it also estranged Gandalf from those whose trust he most required. Still, the seeds of his secret labor took root. While Denethor mistrusted him, others were stirred by his counsel. Captains such as Faramir heard his words, and found in them not manipulation, but truth. Simple folk, soldiers and messengers, looked upon the grey pilgrim, and found a strength they could not name. In these quiet victories, Gandalf's concealment proved its worth, for even when mistrusted at the highest throne, he could still kindle hope where despair threatened. Yet the question lingers like a shadow at the edge of light. If Gondor's steward, proud and noble though he was, could not see Gandalf's secrecy as wisdom, what of the places far from thrones and councils? How did the grey pilgrim's art of concealment shape the lives of those least expected to stand against the dark? To answer this, we must leave the high halls of Minas Tirith and turn our gaze instead to the quiet fields of the Shire, where the smallest of peoples bore the weight of the greatest of burdens. The road from Minas Tirith to the Shire is long in miles, and longer still in temperament, and Gandalf knew that the bridge between them could not be built by edicts or banners, but by patient seasons of conversation, games, stories, and the small courtesies that make a life feel durable. After the heavy air of Gondor's stone halls, he preferred the smell of tilled earth and bakery, smoke drifting over hedges. The world felt wider there, not because the hobbits knew more, but because they had not yet learned to fear what they did not see. He let their cheer settle upon him like an old cloak, and in that quiet he practiced the most exacting discipline of all, doing almost nothing that looked like strategy, while doing precisely what strategy required. It was not idleness, however. It appeared to those who counted actions by the clang of armor or the weight of decrees. It was cultivation, and it demanded a steadier hand than war. He understood that despair corrodes from within long before enemies arrive at the gate, and the Shire, for all its innocence, was not exempt from that slow weathering. Its defense could not be built of walls or watchtowers, because such works would invite the very gaze they were raised to resist. Its defense must be a habit of heart, generosity that resisted petty tyranny, neighborliness that blunted fear-mongering, a stubborn preference for fairness over quick gain. Gandalf encouraged all this not by lecturing, but by participating, lingering at inns and crossroads, sharing pipeweed and anecdotes, rewarding curiosity, and dignifying laughter as a communal inheritance. If a child asked about stars, he told enough to widen wonder and stopped before wonder hardened into pride. If a miller complained about taxes, he listened until the complaint became a story, and the story became a memory, and the memory, somehow, a reason to keep one's word. Fireworks were not diversions so much as lessons disguised as delight. They taught the hobbits to lift their eyes, to recognize that surprise need not be menace, that light can arrive from silence without demand. He would release a wheel that sang across the green, and in the faces gathered under its brief constellation, he would see what he needed to see. Fear loosening its grip, a flicker of communal breath held and released together. Perhaps Naria's warmth worked then, or perhaps it was only the craft of a pilgrim who knew how to make a moment carry more than itself. He never insisted on which. The humility of not naming the mechanism was part of the mechanism's strength, because power that refuses spectacle leaves room for others to grow. He did not keep the Shire safe alone, and he never pretended otherwise. Rangers of the North, wandering under many names, held the long roads against nameless dangers, and Gandalf's gratitude for them ran deep, though few in the Shire knew they existed at all. That was as it had to be. Safety too loudly declared turns quickly into the arrogance that calls danger down upon a roof. The hobbits slept better, because grim men did not, and Gandalf would share a nod with them, at the edge of weathered hedgerows, an exchange of news in low voices, where briar met ditch. Then he would vanish back into the lanes and gardens, content that the best guardians are the ones the guarded never learn to fear. In such seasons of tending, he met Bilbo Baggins, whose curiosity wore politeness like a well-brushed jacket, and whose courage announced itself only when forced to the door. Gandalf did not see in Bilbo a weapon. He saw a mind that could hold two truths at once, love of comfort and love of fairness, and could choose the harder truth without forgetting the softer one. That double capacity mattered more than the sword arms of a dozen captains, because the age to come would not be decided by strength alone, but by whether tenderness could survive contact with duty. That first adventure, which began as an intrusion upon a respectable pantry, became proof that smallness is not a synonym for frailty. When Bilbo returned with songs and scars, and a treasure that no one could identify quickly enough, Gandalf watched more carefully than he let on. Time passed as if it meant to be kind, and the Shire obliged, which is to say it forgot as quickly as it forgave. Bilbo did not seem to change as other hobbits changed. There was a freshness about him that no number of birthdays could wilt, a lightness that was not merely joy, but the absence of a weight no one had taught him to expect. Gandalf noted such things the way a patient gardener notes an unexpected bloom in late season, with gratitude first, and then a question that does not trouble the plant by being asked aloud. He visited more often, never in a straight pattern that would invite inference, and tested nothing that could be called a test. He told stories that made certain words ring: mercy, promise, burden, return. Bilbo listened with the attention of one who had once been lost and found himself again, and sometimes his hand strayed to a pocket as if to confirm the continued presence of a habit. If there was a secret in the Shire, it was not that a ring lay in a drawer behind a locked study door. It was that a people had been allowed to remain naive long enough for courage to grow without the deforming pressure of constant dread. Gandalf understood that innocence is not ignorance, but the memory of trust unbroken, and he guarded that memory as fiercely as any captain holds a breach. He dissuaded merchants with too many sharp questions, discouraged rumour-mongers who tried to import fashionable malice from the wider world, and gently mocked ambition when it strutted in waistcoats and called itself progress. He made himself the lightning rod for resentment, so the Shire could retain its weather. If some called him a disturber of the peace, he accepted the title as the paradox it was, because peace that refuses disturbance becomes a stagnant pond where fear breeds in warm shadows. He did not work only upon the elders, whose opinions are often mostly sediment. He watched the young at their mischief and courtesy alike, and he noticed in Frodo a steadiness that did not brag. It was not a loud quality. It was the patience of one who listens until the world becomes specific. Gandalf walked with him along lanes where the hawthorn stitched white beads into hedges, and he spoke of maps the way others speak of weather, as a thing both predictable and full of change. He did not tell Frodo what he might someday be asked to do, because demanding heroism poisons the well it draws from. Instead, he nourished the habit of choice, the small acts by which a person learns that conscience is not a trumpet, but a tuning fork. Samwise, too, came under his easy attention, and if Gandalf ever lingered by a garden with greater interest than he showed battlefields, it was because he recognized in a gardener the truest refutation of despair. Someone who coaxes sweetness from soil understands that time is an ally when treated with reverence rather than hunger. He asked Sam about potatoes, and got in return a treatise on care that applied equally to friendships and kingdoms. It pleased him to see how loyalty forms without ceremony when people work beside one another in the same light. It pleased him more to see that loyalty can endure a shock, because shocks were coming, and habits formed in green places hold firm when the world goes grey. There were evenings at the Green Dragon when Gandalf let gossip wash over him like rain, and in that cheerful noise he mapped the fault lines of influence better than any lord with a silk curtain and a spy. He learned who spoke before thinking, and who thought before speaking, which families reconciled slowly, and which quickly, where envy still slept, and what might wake it. He bought a round when a quarrel threatened to turn bitter, because bitterness remembered becomes a chain, and Sauron's inventions were merely elaborate chains given more splendid names. It is easier to keep neighbors from hating one another than to undo the hatred after it hardens, and Gandalf cared for the easy effort that prevents the impossible remedy. And yet, ease was not all that lived there. Quiet can carry omens as surely as trumpets, and Gandalf felt them in the dissonant absence that followed some of Bilbo's jokes, in the way certain dates pressed upon the mind, as if invoking anniversaries of events not yet learned. When he left the Shire for long circuits through the wider lands, the same pattern announced itself, murmurings in the east that did not resolve into tidings, traders who would not name their patrons, a smell of fear clinging to wares polished too brightly to hide it. He returned to Hobbiton with stories brighter than the truth, and a concern he would not share, because naming a storm too soon draws it inland before the crops have hardened. His friendship with Bilbo deepened into that rare companionship which permits silence without suspicion. They sat together in the evening, while the fire elaborated upon its single theme, and the pauses between sentences did not feel like omissions, but like acknowledgments that some words should only be spoken when their consequences have become bearable. Bilbo's hand strayed less often to that pocket as years passed, and then more often, again, as if a cycle were completing itself. Gandalf did not flinch from the observation. He stored it beside a dozen others, building a ledger in which the entries were glances and hesitations rather than numbers. He knew the risk of watching too closely. The eye consumes not only what it sees, but what it suspects, and the surest way to invite suspicion is to fix one's gaze upon a single point until the air around it begins to vibrate. So Gandalf allowed his visits to scatter. Sometimes he would vanish for a year, returning with a tune that begged for a chorus. Sometimes he would appear twice in a month, with no purpose except to be present when a letter arrived, or a mood soured. It looked like fondness, and it was, but fondness can be a tactic too, when the stakes require the preservation of a surface under which necessary work can continue. When at last the long murmur of unease became a rhythm he could not ignore, he let caution sharpen into inquiry. He asked questions that sounded like jokes, because jokes disarm the proud and steady, the shy. He nudged at the edges of a tale about a ring discovered beneath mountains, and he watched how memory performed its careful dance around certain steps. Bilbo's story was consistent in the way diligent stories are consistent, and yet it had the faint tremor of a line rehearsed until the living pulse beneath it had been trained to quietness. Gandalf did not accuse, because accusation makes liars of honest men by teaching them to hide. He simply attended, and his attention, being patient, gathered more than hurried certainty ever could. He began to suspect the shape of an answer, but suspicion is not the same as knowledge, and knowledge sought impatiently becomes a weapon turned the wrong way. He left again, because sometimes the only way to learn what a thing is made of is to watch how it behaves when it is not being watched. He travelled far and long, ceaselessly converting rumour into map, grief into warning, and warning into counsel. Pieces fell into their restless places, and with each new placement the image grew clearer. A master who had poured himself into a circlet, a heritage of ruin hidden in plain speech, a harmless country lane that had become, without ever meaning to, the narrow bridge between the world's last freedom and its first servitude. When he returned to the Shire for that famous birthday, he did so with more than fireworks and greetings in his pack. He brought doubt domesticated into method, and method into the kind of test that does not announce itself as such. The party was splendid, as only hobbit parties can be splendid, where abundance is a manner rather than a spectacle, and where the measure of largesse is the number of people who feel noticed. Gandalf played his part, delighting the children and cajoling the elders, and if he watched Bilbo more closely than before, he made the watching an instrument of courtesy rather than judgment. He saw the old friend hesitate at the very moment when generosity became a way to escape, and in that hesitation the concealed history revealed its pulse. It would have been the easiest thing, then, to speak plainly, to expose what hid behind the curtain of habit, to end the performance before the last act turned reckless. Yet the discipline that had governed his long labour did not falter. He waited, letting the event complete itself, because endings reveal characters in ways beginnings never do. When the smoke cleared and the laughter sank back into the grass, Gandalf did not shout or forbid. He walked with Bilbo, and the conversation that followed was not an interrogation, but a rescue carefully handled, a friend guiding another friend away from a cliff by asking him to notice the view rather than the drop. The Shire slept that night as it always had, confident in its fields and its fences, unaware that its safety now stood upon a pinpoint small enough to disappear between thumb and forefinger. Gandalf sat awake longer than was his habit, not because the danger had grown louder, but because it had become articulate. There was a riddle whose answer could no longer be postponed without inviting answers of a different, crueler kind. He had tended a quiet flame for years, so that, when the moment came, a hand from that very hearth could carry a burden no king could bear, without becoming the thing he opposed. Before the grey pilgrim could choose the road ahead, he would have to name the peril precisely. And not even the gentlest fire can warm a house if the ember it shelters is the wrong one. The night after Bilbo's departure lingered in Gandalf's thoughts like a whisper he could not yet decipher. And though the Shire returned to its rhythm of harvests and gossip, he knew that something older and darker lay coiled beneath the surface. Bilbo's reluctance to part with his trinket, the strange resistance that clung to him even as he tried to let it go, was more than simple attachment. Gandalf had seen greed, he had seen possessiveness, and this was neither. This was a shadow that clung to the heart, pressing its claim in silence. The very act of Bilbo's release, aided by Gandalf's gentle firmness, confirmed both the strength of his character and the peril of the object he surrendered. For in that moment, Gandalf's long suspicion ripened into near certainty. This ring was no mere curious relic of dwarven hoards or goblin caves. It was something older, something woven into the history of ruin itself. But suspicions was not enough. Gandalf, master of patience, did not leap to conclusions, for he knew too well that haste invites error. He let Frodo inherit the ring with as little ceremony as possible, trusting that its power, though subtle, would not declare itself immediately. He left the Shire again, outwardly continuing his ceaseless wanderings, but inwardly driven by the need to confirm his fears. His journey took him into archives, to councils, to the company of the wise, where whispers of the past were preserved in brittle scrolls and fading memories. Piece by piece, he reconstructed the trail of Isildur's bane, the ring that had slipped from the hand of the king in the waters of the Anduin, thought lost, yet never destroyed. Its tale had always ended in ambiguity, but Gandalf began to see how absence itself could be a mask. Meanwhile, Frodo bore his inheritance without knowing its full weight. The quiet life of Hobbiton continued around him, but Gandalf's silences were longer, his departures more frequent, and his eyes more searching whenever he returned. He taught Frodo nothing directly about the ring's nature, for he knew the danger of premature knowledge. To name the peril before its time might have broken Frodo's spirit, or worse, stirred the very gaze they most sought to avoid. Instead, Gandalf tested subtly, watching how Frodo carried himself, how he spoke of the ring, how he resisted or yielded to its quiet presence. In these small moments, he measured not only Frodo's resilience, but also the shadow's influence, which seemed to whisper more insistently as years passed. The decisive proof came not in the Shire, but in fire. Gandalf, after long counsel with Elrond, and long journeys through lands scarred by ancient wars, determined that the only way to confirm the ring's identity was to subject it to a test no trinket could withstand. In Frodo's hearth at Bag End, beneath the ordinary crackle of logs, he cast it into the flames. What emerged was the inscription, fiery and implacable, the language of Mordor itself proclaiming ownership and dominion. No doubt remained. This was the One Ring, the very heart of Sauron's power, the lost treasure that had corrupted kings and felled realms. That it lay hidden for so long in the pocket of a hobbit was both absurd and providential, a paradox only Gandalf could recognize as deliberate fate rather than chance. The revelation brought with it not triumph, but burden. For Gandalf, who bore Narya, and who had within him the fire of the Maiar, could easily have claimed the ring for himself. Indeed, Frodo, frightened by the knowledge, offered it freely, pleading for the grey pilgrim to take it. In that moment, concealment reached its most terrible test. Gandalf's hands trembled, for he knew the truth. With the One Ring, he could indeed overthrow Sauron. He could blaze with power beyond reckoning, bend armies to his will, sweep the shadow from the earth. And yet he also knew that in doing so, he would become a tyrant as cruel as the enemy, cloaking domination in the guise of salvation. To take the ring was to become what he opposed. His refusal was not only strength, but secrecy renewed. He could not reveal the depth of his temptation, for to confess it might plant despair in Frodo's heart. Nor could he reveal to Sauron, watching always, that the ring had been found. Concealment now became more than habit, it became survival itself. Gandalf resolved that the LOTR burden must pass not to the mighty, but to the humble, for only the small could bear it without falling into the trap of dominion. Thus the paradox sharpened. Salvation lay not in power displayed, but in power relinquished, not in crowns, but in the bare feet of hobbits treading roads they had never dreamed of walking. This choice set into motion the long chain of events that would define the age. Gandalf's secrecy guided the Council of Elrond, where he revealed enough truth to unify elves, dwarves, and men, yet withheld enough that Sauron's attention never fell squarely upon the ring-bearer until the last possible moment. He cloaked the quest not in armies, but in fellowship, disguising its true purpose behind the guise of alliance. Frodo walked at the center, a hobbit whose strength no prophecy had named, while Gandalf bore the greater burden of silence, to guide without commanding, to protect without revealing, to conceal the truth of their hope, even from allies who might falter beneath its weight. Yet concealment carried cost, as it always had. Boromir's fall was one such price, his despair sharpened by the secrecy that shrouded the council's decisions. Frodo's suffering was another, for the ring's weight pressed harder with each mile, and Gandalf could not lift it for him. The very design of secrecy meant that the smallest shoulders bore the heaviest burden, while the wise carried the burden of watching and waiting, unable to intervene directly without breaking the fragile balance. In this chapter of the tale, the secret Gandalf carried was not merely that he bore Narnia, or that he was more than he appeared. It was that he refused the greatest weapon of all, a refusal that baffled Sauron, confused his allies, and saved Middle-earth. Yet the story could not rest here. For even concealed fire burns, and even veiled strength must sometimes reveal itself. The question that now pressed upon the Grey Pilgrim was simple and terrible. When the moment came to stand against Shadow in open conflict, how much of himself could he reveal without destroying all he sought to preserve? Gandalf's restraint, though necessary, could not last forever, nor could he shield the world indefinitely with secrecy alone. The storm that had been gathering for centuries finally broke, and with it, Gandalf's careful concealments began to crumble. The Fellowship had set out with the hope that secrecy could still shield them, but each step they took toward Mordor drew them further into the light, and the enemy's eye became more aware of their presence. Gandalf knew that when the time came to confront Sauron, the hidden flame within him, the one he had carried so long in silence, would have to be revealed, for the world could not afford to wait any longer for the gradual shaping of hearts. They needed strength, and they needed it now. It was at the bridge of Khazad-dûm that Gandalf's mantle of restraint first truly faltered. He had hidden so much, withheld so much, that even his own spirit felt the strain, The presence of the Balrog, ancient and terrible, was not merely a physical challenge. It was the test of Gandalf's own spirit, of what he had concealed, and how long it could remain hidden in the face of such overwhelming darkness. He knew that the creature was a remnant of Morgoth's ancient power, a symbol of the very thing he had been sent to resist. The Balrog's fire was the antithesis of Gandalf's own, a consuming rage that sought to destroy all hope, all restraint. But Gandalf, armed with his secret flame and the silent power he had concealed for so long, did not retreat. It was then, as the Fellowship's flight through Moria reached its perilous end, that Gandalf made the choice to face the shadow head-on, knowing full well the price he would pay. The battle at the bridge was not one of mere strength, for Gandalf could not defeat the Balrog by force alone. It was a battle of wills, a moment in which Gandalf's restraint gave way to something much greater, his power to resist, to endure, to outlast. With the cry of, "You shall not pass," Gandalf held the Balrog at bay, forcing it to retreat back into the depths of Moria. And in that instant, he knew that something irrevocable had changed. He had broken his silence, not only for the sake of his friends, but for the fate of Middle-earth itself. The cost was immediate. As the Balrog fell, dragging Gandalf with it into the darkness, the entire Fellowship felt the shudder of that loss. Gandalf's presence had been the quiet force that held them all together, a steadying hand that they had relied on without fully understanding it. His fall into shadow left them reeling, for they had not just lost a guide, but a symbol of hope. It was in this moment that they realized how deeply they had come to depend on his strength, even when that strength had been hidden in plain sight. Gandalf's fall, however, was not the end. It was a transition, a necessary sacrifice for something greater. His descent into the abyss, into death itself, was not a defeat, but a transformation. His return as Gandalf the White was, in a sense, a resurrection, not just of body, but of spirit. He emerged from the depths not as the same Gandalf who had fallen, but as a figure renewed, not just by the light of Narya, but by the fire of his own sacrifice. The veil had been lifted, and the full extent of his power could no longer be concealed. His purpose, once subtle and hidden, was now clear to all. The return of Gandalf the White was marked by his command over light, over fire, and over shadow itself. Where once he had guided with patience and humility, now he guided with authority. It was a necessary authority, one forged in the depths of death and rebirth. The cost of his return was not only his transformation, but the acknowledgement that the world could no longer afford to wait for subtlety or secrecy. The time had come for action, for open confrontation with Sauron's forces, and Gandalf knew that his role was no longer to quietly nurture hope, but to wield it as a sword. Even so, his return was not without its complexities. Though his power had been revealed, his humility had not. He did not seek to command or to rule, but he knew that he could no longer conceal what had been entrusted to him. The secrecy that had once protected the world now served only to delay the inevitable confrontation. The task now was not merely to guide, but to act decisively and without hesitation. The war for Middle-earth was no longer a matter of waiting for hope to grow quietly in hidden places. It was a matter of making that hope visible to all, of turning the tide against the darkness before it was too late. Gandalf, now fully revealed, led the charge at Helm's Deep, and then later at Minas Tirith. But his role had shifted in subtle yet significant ways. He was no longer just the guiding force behind a group of friends. He was a symbol of something larger, something older. The power that he had carried for so long in secret had become an indomitable force, one that could not be ignored. The very way he interacted with those around him had changed. He became a rallying cry, a figure of strength that reminded those in his presence of the very essence of what they were fighting for. But Gandalf's path was not yet complete. Even as the final battle loomed, he knew that the end of Sauron's reign was not simply a matter of military victory. It was a matter of a deeper struggle, one that would require more than strength and fire. It would require the courage to let go, to sacrifice not only lives, but even the very hope that had brought them all this far. For in the end, the true strength of Middle-earth lay not in its armies or its rulers, but in the hearts of those who could bear such sacrifice. As he watched the armies of the West prepare for battle, Gandalf understood that the true test was not whether they could defeat Sauron. It was whether they could defeat the darkness within themselves, the darkness that had so often sought to control, to dominate, and to possess. This was the final lesson, and it would be up to Frodo, not Gandalf, to teach it. Frodo's burden had always been more than the physical weight of the ring. It was the spiritual weight of choosing to give up the power to rule, to let go of the very thing that seemed to promise salvation. The final confrontation between Frodo and Sauron was not only a confrontation of wills, but a confrontation of hearts. The moment that Gandalf had long feared, when the ring would be cast into the fires of Mount Doom, was now upon them. Gandalf's role in this final act was not to wield a sword, but to guide Frodo to the edge of the precipice, to give him the strength to let go. And as the ring fell into the fire, Gandalf understood that his task, though marked by years of secrecy and restraint, had always been leading to this moment. The power of the world had always been in the hands of those who knew how to let go, and it was in that letting go that true victory was won. The moment the ring was cast into the fires of Mount Doom, Gandalf stood on the precipice of a world that had changed forever. The air seemed to hum with an unfamiliar silence, one that spoke not of victory, but of release. The weight that had pressed so heavily upon him for so long, an unseen burden, one born in the deepest silence, had lifted, not because of any battle fought with sword or flame, but because a small, determined heart had chosen to let go. In that single, final act of relinquishment, Sauron's dominion over Middle-earth collapsed, not from sheer force, but from the absence of the power that had held it together. Gandalf's heart, too, seemed to release something. For so long, his role had been to guide, to nurture hope, to conceal the fire that could have burned so brightly. Yet he had never truly allowed himself to understand the full extent of what they were fighting for. It wasn't the destruction of Sauron alone. It was the preservation of something deeper, more fragile. The free will of the people of Middle-earth, their right to choose, to act, to grow. The ring, in its own twisted way, had represented all that was wrong with power. It sought to control, to possess, to command, and in its absence, the very freedom of life itself returned to the world. But Gandalf knew that the world, now freed, would not be the same. Even as the fires of Mount Doom consumed the last remnants of Sauron's power, The cost of the journey became apparent. The lands, though saved, were scarred. The peoples who had fought so valiantly, men, elves, dwarves, and hobbits, had borne a price, and that price would never be forgotten. The simplicity of life in the Shire, once untouched by the burden of war, would never return to its former innocence. The scars of the battle were not merely physical. They were etched into the hearts of those who had carried the weight of the ring, who had borne the fire and the fear of a world teetering on the edge of darkness. As Gandalf stood there, in the final quiet aftermath, he realized that his long-held secret was not just about the fire he had carried, but about the path to healing that could now begin. For so long he had concealed himself, hidden his true power, his true nature, because he believed that domination, whether through the ring or through any form of rule, was not the way to true victory. But the destruction of the ring revealed a deeper truth. It was the humility, the restraint, the willingness to let go that had ultimately saved them all. The world, now free from Sauron's shadow, had no need for Gandalf's power to rule or dominate. He had seen that firsthand through the journey of Frodo, who had borne the ring not by strength, but by an act of will, by choosing to relinquish control at the very moment it seemed most needed. And in Frodo's act, Gandalf recognized the lesson that he had long known in theory, but now understood in his heart. True power is not about what one possesses, but about what one can bear to give up. It was in the quiet aftermath that Gandalf finally allowed himself to reflect on what had come to pass. His role had been one of guiding, of teaching, but never of leading in the traditional sense. He had never sought to rule, but had instead fostered the conditions in which others could rise to the challenge. His humility, his restraint, his secrecy, all had served to protect the very thing that was now revealed, the power of choice. In allowing others to act, to fail, to succeed, to struggle, he had preserved the heart of Middle-earth. He had shown them that their choices were what would ultimately define them, not the power they sought to wield. As the people of Middle-earth began to rebuild, to heal, and to recover from the devastation of war, Gandalf knew that his work was far from over. His guidance was still needed, but now it would be of a different kind. The darkness had been vanquished, but the world was still fragile, and it was in the quiet moments of peace, in the rebuilding of homes and hearts, that true strength would be forged. And so Gandalf turned, not towards new battles or new wars, but towards the quiet path that would lead him back to the places where he had first learned the value of humility. He would continue to walk among the people of Middle-earth, not as a ruler, not as a king, but as a guide, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, there was always the possibility of light, always the possibility of choice. As he looked back at the Shire, the place that had been so untouched by the troubles of the world, he realized that it was not the great acts of power that would define Middle-earth's future, but the simple acts of kindness, of choice, of love. It was in the hearts of those who had stood beside him, who had chosen to fight, to struggle, to hope, that the true victory had been won. For in the end, it was not the ring that had determined their fate, but the courage to let go of it. The journey was over, but the story was far from finished. Middle-earth had been saved, not through domination, but through the quiet, enduring strength of those who chose to protect it with all their hearts. Gandalf had kept his secret for so long, and in the end it had been the secret of letting go, of knowing when to step back, when to trust, when to allow others to rise, that had truly saved them all. As the dust of battle settled and the fires that had raged in Mordor were extinguished, the world of Middle-earth began to shift, its axis ever so slightly changed by the acts of those who had borne the burden of power, those who had chosen to bear the weight of hope when all seemed lost. The victory was not one of grandeur, nor one of immediate triumph. It was the quiet, steady victory of choice, of sacrifice, and of those who had been willing to relinquish control for the sake of a greater good. Gandalf now returned to the world with the light of victory in his eyes, knew that the world would never be the same. It had been shaped by the events of the past, yes, but it would be shaped still by the hearts of the people who had stood through the storm. His task now was not to lead, not to rule, but to guide once more, gently, subtly, without claiming dominion over the very lives he had sought to protect. The choice had always been theirs, the hobbits, whose hearts had been tested and forged in the fires of Mount Doom, had learned the most profound lesson of all, that true strength does not come from wielding power, but from choosing not to wield it. Frodo's courage, Sam's loyalty, Merry's bravery, and Pippin's determination were the quiet victories that would define the future of Middle-earth. They were the reminders that even in the smallest hands, great things could be done, and the greatest of victories could be won not by domination, but by understanding the true weight of what it means to let go. But the price of that victory was not small. As Gandalf had feared, the land itself was scarred. The people who had fought, those who had endured the darkness, were now faced with a new challenge, to rebuild what had been broken, not just in stone and wood, but in spirit. And for Frodo, the ring's weight had left an indelible mark. Even after the ring was destroyed, even after the world had been saved, Frodo could not shake the feeling of its presence, the lingering echo of the burden he had carried for so long. It was a quiet suffering, one that no one could see, yet it gnawed at him, reminding him of the cost of such power and the toll it had taken on his soul. As the days passed, Gandalf knew that Frodo's journey was far from over. The healing of Middle-earth, like the healing of a wounded heart, would take time. Gandalf, with the wisdom he had gained through years of patience and restraint, understood that peace was not an instant gift, but a long process of tending and nurturing. Frodo, who had once been so unwilling to leave his quiet life in the Shire, would now need to find his own peace in the silence of his memories, in the quiet spaces between his heartbeats. And it was Gandalf's task to help him navigate that journey, just as it had always been. But it wasn't just Frodo who would need guidance. The world was changing, and Gandalf, who had once been a quiet guide in the shadows, now stood as a figure who could not be ignored. The people of Middle-earth looked to him with respect, with gratitude, and perhaps with a certain wariness, for they had seen in him a power that had been hidden for so long. But Gandalf knew that power, when wielded too openly, could turn into something darker, something more dangerous than the shadow itself. And so he remained, as he always had been, a figure of quiet strength, of subtle influence, never seeking the throne of kingship, but content to walk among the people, offering counsel and guidance where it was needed. It was in this quiet, reflective time that Gandalf came to realize something about his own journey. He had been sent to Middle-earth not to lead armies, not to rule kingdoms, but to teach the importance of choice, of freedom, and of restraint. He had been a steward of hope, guiding those who had the courage to take that hope and use it in the face of overwhelming darkness. And now, as the world began to rebuild, he saw that his task was not yet complete. There was still work to be done, still hearts to heal, still lessons to impart. The people of Middle-earth would never forget the battle that had been fought, nor the sacrifices that had been made. But they would also never forget the quiet victories that had been won, the courage of the small, the wisdom of restraint, and the power of a single choice to change the course of history. Gandalf, the Grey Pilgrim, had come to Middle-earth as a humble guide, but he had left it as something more, a symbol of the strength that lies in choosing to do what is right, even when it is the hardest thing to do. As Gandalf looked out over the lands that had once been darkened by shadow, he saw the light of a new day beginning to break through. The sun rose over the hills, and with it came the promise of renewal, of healing, and of peace. It was a peace that would not come quickly, but it would come in time. And in that peace, Gandalf understood that his work was done. The world had been saved, not by domination, but by the strength of those who had chosen to protect it, and the courage of those who had chosen to let go. With a final glance at the horizon, Gandalf turned and began to walk once more, not toward the seat of power, but toward the quiet places where hope still lingered. For in the end, it was in those quiet places that the true strength of Middle-earth lay, not in the thrones, not in the armies, but in the hearts of those who had learned to choose, to endure, and to protect what was most precious. The years that followed the fall of Sauron were filled with a quiet, steady healing, a renewal that could only come after the great fires of war had finally burned out. Gandalf had seen countless eras rise and fall in the long course of his existence. But there was something uniquely delicate about this time, this moment of peace. It was as if the world itself held its breath, hesitant to disrupt the fragile harmony that had been woven from the threads of sacrifice, resilience, and choice. The people of Middle-earth, who had fought so bravely and suffered so deeply, now turned to the future, uncertain but hopeful. Gandalf, too, felt the weight of that quiet peace. It was a peace won through loss, through enduring hardship, and he knew better than anyone that such peace was never fully guaranteed. There would always be forces at work, hidden in the shadows, or carried in the hearts of men, that threatened to unravel the fragile threads of hope. He had seen the darkness before, and he knew that it could return in subtle ways. But for now, for this moment, there was peace, one that would not come again if it was not carefully tended. He returned to Gondor, where Aragorn had taken his rightful place as King Elessar, and Minas Tirith, once a city of mourning, was now alive with the energy of rebirth. The once darkened streets now glowed with the warmth of sunlight, and the people of the city began to rebuild, not just their homes, but their spirits. Aragorn ruled with wisdom and kindness, but even he, though strong, was a man, and there were challenges ahead that no king, however noble, could face alone. Gandalf, now fully revealed, became a quiet presence in these times of rebuilding. His role was not to lead, but to guide, offering counsel when needed, lending strength when asked, and reminding the people that peace, like victory, must be worked for and protected. The return of the elves to the west was another part of the world's healing, though bitter-sweet. They had been the guardians of Middle-earth for countless ages, and though their wisdom and light remained, the time had come for them to leave, to return to their homes in the undying lands. Gandalf saw them off, knowing that their departure was part of the natural order. Yet it was a painful thing to watch. The elves had been the keepers of beauty, of wisdom, and of a timeless grace that had held the world in balance. Their departure marked the end of an age, and while the world would continue, it would continue without the ancient songs and light that had sustained it for so long. But Gandalf did not mourn the departure of the elves in the same way others did. He understood that their leaving was a necessary part of the world's transition, a passing of the torch to the new generations of men, dwarves, and hobbits. The elves had carried Middle-earth's history with them, and now it was time for those who remained to make their own history. The time of the elves had ended, but the time of men, and of the other peoples of Middle-earth, was just beginning. And Gandalf, in his quiet way, would be there to guide them, to help them navigate the challenges that lay ahead. Frodo, too, had changed. His journey, though it had saved the world, had come at an immense personal cost. The scars left by the ring, the weight of its influence, had not vanished with Sauron's fall. Frodo, with Sam at his side, had returned to the Shire. But the Shire that they had left behind was no longer the same. Frodo carried with him the memories of a world filled with darkness, a world where the light had almost been extinguished. He had done his part, but it was a part that had taken more from him than he could ever fully express. Gandalf knew that Frodo would never fully heal from the burden he had borne, and though he had tried to keep the ring-bearer from feeling the weight of his sacrifice, he understood now that some burdens were too heavy to ever be truly put down. Frodo had given up his innocence, his peace, and part of his spirit, and though the world was free from Sauron, Frodo would never be the same. In the years that followed, Gandalf continued to watch over the lands, offering his wisdom where it was needed, lending strength where it was lacking. He did not seek recognition, nor did he long for the time when he had wielded great power. He had given that up long ago, understanding that true power lay not in domination, but in the quiet, steady acts of courage and love. He had learned that leadership was not about command, but about guiding others, helping them find their own strength when they had none left to give. And as the years wore on, Gandalf grew older, his time in Middle-earth drawing to a close. He knew that his role was not to stay forever, that he had accomplished what he had been sent to do. The world was no longer a place of despair, but a place of hope, and it would carry on without him. It was time for him to leave, just as the elves had, and to return to the lands beyond the sea. But before he left, he made one final visit to the Shire. There, in the quiet fields that had once been so untouched by the wars of the world, Gandalf sat with the hobbits, his old friends. He sat with Frodo and Sam, with Merry and Pippin, and they spoke of the days that had passed and the days that were yet to come. The future was uncertain, but there was a light in the hearts of those who had fought for it, and Gandalf knew that it would endure. As he stood to leave, Gandalf looked back one last time at the peaceful land he had helped to protect. The Shire, though changed, would always be a symbol of the strength that comes from kindness, from choice, and from the quiet determination to do what is right, even when it is the hardest thing to do. And so, Gandalf, the Grey Pilgrim, the guide and the guardian, made his final journey west to the Undying Lands. He had completed his mission, and the world he left behind was not the same world he had entered. But it was a world that had learned something invaluable. That hope, no matter how small, can endure, and that even in the darkest times, light can be found in the most unexpected places. The journey was over, and the world was free. Gandalf's journey had always been one of quiet influence, of guiding others to understand that the greatest strength comes not from the power one wields, but from the choices one makes, the restraint one practices, and the hope one nurtures, even in the darkest of times. His time in Middle-earth had been marked by acts of courage, wisdom, and sacrifice, acts that, when woven together, had shaped a world no longer dominated by shadows, but by the possibility of peace. Yet, as Gandalf sailed westward, leaving the shores of Middle-earth behind, he knew that his departure marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, not just for him, but for all who had fought beside him. The world he left behind was not one of perfect peace. Such a thing could never be attained in a world that still carried the memories of old wounds, the scars of battles fought, and the burdens of hard-won victories. But it was a world that had learned, in its own painful way, the value of choice, of love, and of the quiet power of small acts done with great courage. The great kingdoms had been rebuilt, the Shire was restored, and the peoples of Middle-earth had learned that victory over darkness is never final, but a continuous cycle of vigilance, hope, and renewal. Gandalf knew that his time was not one of domination, but of teaching. He had never sought to be the one who stood at the center, but the one who helped others find their own center. In his quiet way, he had always believed that the true strength of a people lay not in their ability to fight, but in their ability to forgive, to rebuild, and to love again, even when it seemed the hardest thing to do. And so, as he made his way toward the Undying Lands, he looked back one final time at the land that had shaped him as much as he had shaped it, knowing that the world was in good hands, that the seed of hope had been planted and would continue to grow in ways he could never fully see. But even as Gandalf sailed across the sea, he knew that his story was not truly finished. The legacy of his work would live on in the hearts of those he had touched. It would live on in the courage of Frodo, in the loyalty of Sam, in the wisdom of Aragorn, and in the simple, quiet lives of the hobbits who had learned the value of the small, the humble, and the enduring. As Gandalf crossed the sea, he thought of the many journeys he had taken, the many lives he had touched, and the many lessons he had learned. He thought of the times he had walked alone, and the times he had walked with others. He thought of the burdens he had carried, and the moments when he had let go, when he had trusted others to carry the weight. And as the shores of Middle-earth faded from view, Gandalf understood, at last, that the greatest lesson of all was not about power, but about the strength to relinquish it, to trust others with it, and to believe that, in the end, it would always be enough. He had come to Middle-earth as a guide, as a humble servant of the Valar, tasked with protecting the fragile flame of hope. He had left behind a world that was scarred, yes, but one that had learned the true meaning of resilience, of sacrifice, and of enduring love. And now, as he sailed westward, he knew that his task had been completed, that his work was done. The ring had been destroyed. Sauron's shadow had been cast down. The free peoples of Middle-earth had chosen their fate, and though the road ahead would be long, it would be their road, one they would walk with open eyes and hearts full of courage. Gandalf's legacy would live on in the choices they made, in the ways they would continue to shape their world, and in the quiet moments of peace that would follow the storm. As he looked toward the horizon, toward the lands beyond the sea, Gandalf felt no sorrow. He felt only a deep, abiding peace. He had been a part of something greater than himself, something that would endure long after he had passed beyond the shores of Middle-earth. And in that peace, he knew that his story, though it had come to an end, was not the end of the story. For the light he had helped kindle would never go out, as long as there were hearts willing to carry it. And so, Gandalf sailed into the west, his journey complete. But the world he had shaped, the hope he had nurtured, would continue to grow, for as long as there were those willing to listen, to learn, and to choose. The world of Middle-earth, like the flame that burned in Gandalf's heart, would endure. And in that endurance, the greatest victory of all had been won. And with that, Gandalf's story came to its final chapter. Not with an ending, but with the promise of a new beginning, one that would unfold in the quiet moments of everyday life, in the choices of the many who had learned from his example, and in the legacy of hope he had left behind.